This video segment is brought to you by Credit Grid, your source for business credit knowledge. In this segment, we will explore how markets establish value. Let's begin. First of all, let's think about money. Money helps us compare the relative value of goods and services that are sometimes very different. Like, why does a head of lettuce cost less than a gallon of milk? In considering this, we need the concept called relative scarcity. The idea of relative scarcity helps us understand why prices are different and why do they change relative to each other over time. The economic scarcity of something depends on the interaction of supply and demand together, not just on the quantity of something that is available. Let's think of some examples. Can you think of some things that are really few in number? In fact, there might only be one of them, but still they have low value. Think about an old 8-track tape cartridge of organ music. How much would you really pay for that, even if there was only one of them? Probably not much. Then, think about some things that are available in large numbers but are still very expensive. Diamonds, for example. There are thousands of them available, and yet they all have high prices relative. So the secret is unraveled when we understand that relative scarcity is the amount of demand given the available supply. So in the case of the 8-track, even though there was only one, if no one wants it, what's it worth? But then on the other hand, if there are thousands of diamonds, but tens of thousands of people wanting them, what happens to their prices? I think you get my point. So, relative scarcity establishes typical market prices for goods and services, but changes in relative scarcity cause changes in those prices in the same direction. So if something gets more relatively scarce, the price rises. If it becomes less relatively scarce, the price falls. So let's unwind this still further. If demand increases relative to the supply, typical market prices increase. For example, what would happen to the price of tomatoes if the demand for salsa increased? Well, that's right. The price of tomatoes would rise because the demand for tomatoes would rise to make more salsa, of course. On the other hand, if supply increases relative to the demand and suppliers are starting to flood the market, prices will fall. What would happen to car prices, for example, if companies all of a sudden doubled production for the same level of demand that there was in the market? Prices would plummet, and we would all be very happy. But it won't happen. So, if supply decreases relative to demand, what happens to typical prices? And on the other hand, what happens if demand decreases relative to supply? You think about that. But here's the answer. If supply decreases, prices rise. Because why? There's more demand relative to the available supply because the supply fell. On the other hand, if demand decreases and people want less of something, prices tend to fall. So, relative scarcity determines prices and changes in those prices. Price follows the changes in demand in the same direction, and by that I mean if demand rises, prices rise. But when we have changes in supply, prices move in the opposite direction. So if supply increases, prices fall. So prices move in the opposite direction of supply, typically, but in the same direction as demand. Remember, we're talking about typical prices and changes in them. It is true that there is some variation possible for quality differences, region differences, advertising effects, design differences among competitor brands, among other things. So what we're talking about here when we're saying relative scarcity determines prices, we are talking about the general price structure that we tend to observe in the markets in our country. So, what should you take away from this? You should take away from this that great business people pay attention to general market changes. They read the news, they watch, they prepare for them, and they take that information and position themselves to be able to thrive during the changes no matter which direction they go. Now, use this knowledge to help you grow your business and build your wealth. Thank you for watching. This video was brought to you by Credit Grid, your source for business credit knowledge.